She's an author, historian, and activist. Her first novel is The Third Mrs. Galway. She has copies for sale if you want to check it out. But it takes place here in Utica. It involves tons of actual facts and people from Utica history, which is great. She is also a member of the Oneida County Freedom Trail and one of the originators and one of the principal organizers of Utica's Abolition History Day in 2015 at Hope Chapel. She was born and raised in Utica and is very committed to the community here. So without further ado, Ms. Deirdre Sinnott.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate that. And I'm so glad to see you all today. I've been obsessively checking the weather, you know, snow, rain, sleet, but cold. You got the cold. So anyway, I appreciate it, and I'm so glad to see everybody here. This presentation is part of the project of researching the history of Hope Chapel, which was the first African-American church in the Mohawk Valley. And Reverend Baugh, who is the pastor there, had asked me to help research that. And in the process, I saw in the catalog, the electronic catalog of the Oneida County History Center, a reference to Hiram Lodge Black Masons. And so I said, hey, it says there's a picture. Can anybody find the picture? And one of the volunteers got up and she started moving around and opening drawers and going through files. And finally, she came up with this wonderful photo, just a small version of it. And it was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Look at this photo. And then we flipped the photo over, and there was a number of the names written down by some wonderful person who came in and knew who was who and wrote down the names. It's like row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. And that was like the catalyst to get me to start looking it up. It was just before Juneteenth this last summer where I decided, okay, I'm going to really dig in here, and I started poking the names into the search engines that I use, and I'll get into that. But let me go back to what is supposed to be the beginning of my talk. In 1908, 18 years before this photo was taken, the NAACP was founded. From 1900 to 1927, at least 15 schools for higher education opened. Many of them are still operating today, and these are the historically black colleges and universities, known also as the HBCUs. At this time, the Harlem Renaissance is booming. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay are producing some of their major works. And W.E.B. Du Bois had already written several books, including his masterpiece, The Soul of Black Folks. The photographer who's in the center there is James Van Der Zee, and he was going around New York City collecting images from Harlem and all over of people just like, this is a beautiful wedding and this wonderful woman holding flowers, and he did this self-portrait. And if you could see, it's hard to read, but he's holding a newspaper, and you can't see the whole thing, but and I'm going to be using language that's from the papers and stuff, so it's old language. I apologize about it anyway. It says, it's about colored troops fighting in World War II, and they're in hand-to-hand combat, and it's on this whole front page, and he's holding and pointing to it. Of course, it's not all just art and music and literature. In the South, there was terrible oppression. There was lynchings and riots and violence against black people. Segregation and Jim Crow laws tried to constrain the lives of black people in every sector of life. That repression produced the Great Migration of African American people out of the southern states and into the northern cities. You're going to learn about many folks and their families from this picture, who left their place of birth to come to the north in hope of finding safety and work and a chance of a life free from racism. I also should note that Calvin Coolidge was the president, and the Depression is just 2 years away. So this is 1927. The Depression happens in 1929. So let's turn back to the day of this celebration. It's November 1927. At least 52 people came together at the reopening of Hiram Lodge, Prince Hall Masons, number 18. They got dressed up. They wore party hats. Some young folks played music. I imagine there was food and beverages and dancing. The occasion was so important that they arranged for a local photographer from the Modern studio on Bleecker Street to capture the moment. As I said, there were the names. And this person's handwriting is 100% better than mine, but still trying to figure out exactly what names these were was a challenge. And one of the challenging ones, you see May and James there? And I looked at this, and I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I finally figured out it was Wormworth. And then the second that I put Wormworth in, all of a sudden there was like all of these people who I could find. My first step in researching was to go to the website Find a Grave, and I plugged in the names from the list. Finding the birth and death dates of someone opens up other archives. I used Ancestry.com, where I could find census material, draft cards, marriage and death certificates, and other lists that the state keeps. Another big research for information was searching the newspapers of the era. I went to FultonHistory.com, and I focused on the Observer-Dispatch and the Utica Daily Press, because those papers were covering this period a little bit before and a little bit after. Then, once I had all of that, I came here and searched the catalog again, now that I had the names of people worked out, to try to find out what I could from the catalog here. So what I did is I got lots of facts, lots and lots of facts, but I don't have many stories. And my life and your life and everybody else's life, that's not just facts. It's what happens to us as we move along in time. And so I only know a few, and I'll tell you the ones I know, but I'm hoping that maybe some of you have some stories too that we can go into after I'm done with my talk. We're going to open it up for questions and that kind of thing. Also, if I got something wrong, I want to hear about it, because like I had a whole back and forth about one family, like was it a father, brother, son, and daughter, or, well, we got it all straightened out. So I want to hear about it, and if you have memories, I want to hear them. I'm probably going to ask some people to maybe take notes for me. I have some pads, so when we do that transition, hopefully we got some volunteers who can take notes. And if you have more than what we can cover, kind of quickly, give me your phone number, and I will call you, and we'll try to get this all put together in a way that we can preserve it for other people after us to learn about this particular period, this particular photo, and these particular people. So Freemasonry itself is very old. It originally comes from the European guilds. Here you see George Washington, who was a master at the Lodge of Alexandria, Virginia. It's not necessary for me to go into detail about the Masons, and I don't know much about them anyway, and I certainly don't know any of the secrets of them. But suffice to say, if you get together for support, for fellowship, there's benefits, and it's desirable to do that. You might notice in this picture that all the Masons are men. That's common. Right now, there are some female lodges, but they're not recognized by all the Masons. And there's also other fraternal organizations that women who are married to Masons participate in, and obviously women who are not married to Masons also participate in those. And you'll also see there's no black members in this particular photo. So Prince Hall was a Black American. He might have been enslaved, but he might not have. There's a couple of different people who have looked into him deeply, and they haven't been able to determine exactly. He was definitely working for somebody, but he might not have been enslaved. He might have been free. It's just not clear. So he founded Prince Hall Masonry on September 29th, 1784. And the American Revolution is almost over. It's just the last bit of the American Revolution at that time. So let's turn to Utica. After the end of the Civil War, and this is from 1866, the paper noticed that some fine-looking colored men were spotted in town. They were queried, and it turned out that they were looking to start a new Mason lodge of black men in Utica called Hiram Lodge. 1 year later, Utica had a Hiram Lodge, and men began to join. They rented rooms, and they gathered for their meetings and their rituals. They longed for a permanent home so that they could stop leasing rooms and renting places to meet, so that they had a place that they could go to and that would be theirs. So why join a fraternal organization? On the side over here, you'll see the broken stones of slavery, persecution, and discrimination. And this fellow is walking up the steps of religion, fraternalism, industry, education, finance, power, and he's saying, tell them we're rising. So people were getting together as part of that part of Black history about uplift and trying to lift people from where they were up to a more equity with the white people. So if you look over on the left side, it says, colored Masons transform shack into fine temple. So in 1922, the members begin fundraising for this building that they want to buy. And their wives and daughters, they organized many fundraisers, had cooking things, they had dances, they had cakewalks, they had whatever they could do to come up with money that they put into a pot. And it took 3 years to gather enough funds to buy a building and renovate and equip it with furniture, kitchens, stoves, and electric lighting. The building had been damaged by fire, so there were not even staircases going from one floor to the next. 5 months of work, and it was the Masons who did most all of the labor there. The building is almost complete, and they're ready for an opening ceremony. And you can see there's the headline. This was such a big event that it got a big notice in the Observer Dispatch. You see this red dot way over here? That's Broad Street. That's right near where Kossuth kind of comes down. It's east of Mohawk. That's where the lodge was, 515 Broad Street, and now it's just some kind of industrial area. Okay, so they have this lodge. They're in it for 2 years. They're enjoying their home, and boom, fire breaks out. February 13th, 1927. The cause was not known. The fire department speculated that was one of the stoves had overheated, and I assume they're burning coal or wood because they had different stoves on each level rather than one furnace burning oil or something like that. So one of them must have overheated, and there was the fire. The article says, William H. Howard, who is in this picture, secretary of the lodge, stated today's loss would run about $8,000, but $2,000 of insurance was carried. He said that inside the building were several $1,000s worth of equipment and paraphernalia that was destroyed. And that included like a piano. I mean, they had everything set up. So they work hard and they reopen. This says October 22nd, but I don't think they really opened until November. I think there was some delays. They expected they were going to open, and then a second article says they're open. That brings us up to 1927. So I believe that this photo is from the opening night party. They've got 3 bunches of flowers. You can see one in the front row center, and then in the back row there's this big basket, and over to the right side another big basket of flowers. There's these 4 young men with musical instruments. Everybody's wearing a party hat because it's an important moment. Now, it's challenging to talk about 52 people in one presentation, okay? But here it goes. I'm going to go through it, and well, I'm sure I'm going to make it all the way through. But anyway, I'm going to start. I grouped people by family at first, alphabetically, and then singletons continued alphabetically. And then at the end, I've got like 11 people who are unidentified. So if anything sparks anybody, if you think you see somebody looks like somebody you know, let's try to figure that out. So Henrietta Anderson has her hand on her son Leroy's shoulder. She was listed as the head of a household in the 1920 U.S. Census. He worked at various jobs, including porter, janitor, shipping clerk, and musician. Apparently, he had a lovely bass voice and was a member of Hope Chapel. His age was such that he had to register for both the First and the Second World War draft. So I don't know if he served. This is the one area where I didn't get to research if people served, but he had to register for both drafts just because he was aged somewhere in the middle there. This is 10-year-old Dorothy Brown. Her parents are Robert and Octavia Lodge Boyer. This young man next to her was referred to as Mr. Brown on the back of the photo. I don't know if he's related. I guessed at his name being James because I kept seeing a James Brown listed again and again in contemporary articles about Hiram Lodge. So I hadn't seen anybody else who had that last name, so maybe he's James. If anyone recognizes him, let me know. This is, in the 1910 U.S. Census, Charlotte Fletcher is one of 6 children. Her father's name is Sanford Fletcher, and he's working as a teamster on the barge canal, and I believe that means he drove the mules that pulled the barge along. Charlotte's sister, Anita, is working as she's not in this picture, but she's working as a elevator girl, and later both Charlotte and Anita work as chambermaids in hotels. And next to her there is Charlotte's mother, Harriet. She's married to Sanford. He's not pictured, but Sanford was a cleaner at the Majestic Theater for a while. They lived on Whitesboro Street, and at that time Sanford was listed as a city employee. In the 1910 census, there's these 2 very interesting and heartbreaking questions that are asked of all of the women. Question number 1 was, how many live births have you given? Question number 2 is, how many are still alive? And when you go through this, it's chilling. In the case of Harriet, she had 11 births with only 6 surviving in 1910. Okay, the Hamlet family. I think we have members of the Hamlet family here right now. We've talked to other members of the Hamlet family. James Hamlet, he's a leader of Hiram Lodge. He was at one time master and also was listed as Masonic chief. He was born in Virginia. His mother was from Barbados, and his father was also born in Virginia during or just after the era of enslavement. James and his family might have been tenant farmers. The 1900 census says they were renting a farm there in Virginia. James's wife, Olive Leota Cave, who's not pictured, that's his wife. In Utica, she worked as a domestic in a private home. James worked at the Hotel Utica. He was a leader of St. Paul's Baptist Church as well, and he died very suddenly of a heart attack. It was really unexpected. Nathaniel Buster Hamlet is right there in the middle, number 35. He's married to Alice Jackson, number 36, and they got married in Rome. He was the brother of James. He and his wife Alice moved to Reidsville, North Carolina, where they worked on a farm there, and he too died of a heart problem, a coronary embolism. Alice was the daughter of Emmett and Oreen Thrill Jackson. Alice worked as an elevator operator in a dry goods store. Okay, the Howard family. William Howard was the husband of Jenny Vanderpool Howard. She was born in Canada, and William was born in Tennessee in 1858. His parents were born in Maryland, so there's a very good chance he was born enslaved and that his parents might have been also. Because Jenny was born in Canada, her parents might have been freedom seekers who ended up settling there before the US Civil War. Now, she was born just after the end of the Civil War, but her family might have not returned to the United States until after 1869. At the time of this photo, William owned a house, 413 Broad Street, not far from where Hiram Lodge was. Their son Charles, who's pictured, is only about 16 in the photo, but he seems to have been playing the banjo at the party. In the 1940s, Charles was a musician in an orchestra, and Charles went on to marry Evelyn Glenn in 1936. In the fall of 1940, he registered for the World War II draft, and he was working at Utica Radiator Corp. Anna Jackson's about 53 years old in this photo. She was married to John Jackson. Her son Johnny, pictured there, is 13 years old. Their niece Mary Frank was living with them in 1930, according to the census. Her husband worked at the DPW, and she did housework for a private family. They all lived at 504 J Street. The Ralstons. I have been absolutely unsuccessful in finding anything out about the Ralstons. Their name never popped up. Maybe it's misspelled, maybe something else, I don't know. But look at them. They're at this party, very handsome. I wish I knew more. Just 2 years before this party, Devona and Laura Rippey were married at Hope Chapel. She was born in North Carolina, or he was born in North Carolina, and she was born in Monitor Falls, New York. That's at the south end of Seneca Lake. They were both involved in fraternal organizations. They owned a house on Genesee Street, which was designated part of a huge urban renewal project. And that house at 406 Spring Street was razed after it was bought by the city for $6,100. After that, they appeared to have moved to Shelby, North Carolina. George Robinson was active at Hiram Lodge. In 1923, when the building at 515 Broad Street was purchased and renovated, he was the worshipful master and later the district deputy. He's about 36 in this picture. Venus's father was from Alabama. She and George rented a house at 415 Catherine Street for $25 a month. They owned a radio. Now that's a question in the census, and you go, huh, but it meant something, because a lot of people didn't have the money to own a radio, but they did. George's relatives came from New York State. He worked as a porter at the railway station. In the 1940 census, Venus was not living with George. She's the head of a household, and she has 3 sisters living with her at 220 Liberty Street. I don't know if George died or if they separated, but Venus was supporting that extended family with money she earned from the Works Progress Administration as a maid. So the WPA, not only do we get urban renewal, but the WPA is part of this story. The Titus family. In this photo, John Titus is about 57. He's married to Anna T. Titus, who's not pictured. They have 2 children. There's a chance that Anna's parents were also enslaved. John worked as a porter in a theater, and he is later married to a different woman named Sarah. He's a member of Hope Chapel. In the 1900 census, he lists his father, Charles, as born in 1812, as being born into slavery. I said I don't have many pictures, but for John's brother, Charles W. Titus, who's not pictured here, I have one really bad story. The patriarch Charles, who was born enslaved, was living in Utica, and he sent his young son, Charles W. Titus, north to Deerfield to work at a farm. And there the child was abused by a kind of an overseer, and probably the family that was hired the overseer and was in charge there. He suffered frostbite so severe that his feet turned black. Once the suffering of the boy was discovered, he was retrieved and brought back to Utica. He was brought before a doctor, and his feet were both amputated. He survived, and he lived as a peddler, and he had his own stand on the street where he was selling different wares. Apparently, he was able to move about on the stumps of his feet, on the stumps of his legs. He was married, but he had no children. Now, John, pictured here's son, Charles Thomas Titus, pictured here, is married to Mary, who is 25 in the photo. Charles works as a garbage collector, and she works in a hotel. They have 3 children, and later on, Charles also works as a chauffeur for a private family. Just one more detail, to just go back to Charles, the guy who had been born enslaved, who's the patriarch of the family. He was found dead. Apparently, he got hit by a train, and he was like thrown off, and they found his body the next day. But before his death, he had gained a kind of status among his neighbors as a good person who people came with to consult with on different questions. Gussie Wilborn was a member of Hope Chapel and was in the Starlight Chapter 6 of the Order of the Eastern Star and the Pride of the West 45 Order of the Golden Circle. She was married to Thomas, who's not pictured, and he hailed from Tennessee, and he worked as a bootblack. Gussie was born in Virginia shortly after the war. They lived in Herkimer, and then they moved to Utica, where they had a house on 411 Catherine Street. They had 3 daughters, one son, who died much later of tuberculosis in a hospital. In 1910, in that census, Gussie reported that she'd given birth to 9 babies, with 4 surviving. I didn't find out much about her daughters, Adele, Doris, or Anna, but Violet, who's not pictured, worked in 1920 as an inspector at a knitting mill. Here we have 3 members of the Wormworth family: Jimmy, the son, May, the mother, and James E., the father. But the family goes back even further in the history of Utica than right now. Richard E. Wormworth was James's father, and he was married to Emma Pell. The Pells, some of them, were enslaved in Oneida County before emancipation. Richard worked for abolitionists who lived on John Street, probably either James and Cynthia DeLong or Mr. and Mrs. Ezra Thompson. Both locations were on the Underground Railroad. Richard would have been involved in those activities, absolutely. He would have been helping freedom seekers, as is stated in his obituary. Now, Jimmy Wormworth was a musician his entire life. His son, so this young Jimmy here, Jimmy's son and grandchildren, Tracy and James, are all still alive, and they're all still in the music industry. Jimmy had a band called Jimmy Wormworth and his Chocolate Dandies. I love that title. They played weekly and seemed to have a lot of success. He was part of the Southland Jazz Band, along with the other 3 guys pictured with the musical instruments: Johnny Jackson, Charlie Howard, and Willis Brooks. Jimmy's parents, James E. and May Valentina, were members of Hope Chapel. James, number 10 there, James was a manager of the local black baseball teams, which they were like, I don't understand baseball and the levels at all right? But they weren't part of like the major black leagues, but there was a minor black league that played around the state, and he was in charge of those teams. And he was well known for his service to the community. He was involved in the Boy Scouts. So Hiram Lodge organized a troop to circumvent the de facto segregation of the Boy Scouts in Utica. And James, unfortunately, died very suddenly at the beginning of 1836. Now, May was active in the Eureka Social Club and the Pride of the Golden West Circle number 18, and she volunteered at events at Hope Chapel. And it says here very importantly, I can't find anything about Willis Brooks other than he was a musician. Henry is 18 in this photo. He was born to Eva Bush, who was a laundress and a domestic in a private household. Henry goes to work at the Hotel Utica, and he marries a woman named Yolanda, who works as a maid. His aunt, Elizabeth Lewis, is listed on his World War II draft card as the person who will always know his address. Albert Ebo was a son of Bonepack and Josephine Ebo. Josephine seems to have had a long-term illness. In the 1880 census, she's listed as much confined. Albert worked as a teamster for Jones Trucking Company. He was a member of Hope Chapel and was part of Utica's Cosmopolitan Minstrel. In 1950, there was a place called Ebo Hall on 55 J Street. In 1900, he and his wife Luella were living in Clinton. They have a son named William at the time. Later, Albert marries Eleanor Hicks, and they have a daughter, Mar Elise Ebo. Hazel was born in Georgia, as were her parents. I'll be talking about her sister in just a moment. Hazel's husband, John, also had parents who'd been born in Georgia. Hazel worked as a stenographer, which seems to me to be one of the very few so-called professional jobs that people had within the group. John and Hazel's daughter, Helen, worked as a teacher, and their son, Hugo, worked as a waiter. For a while, John worked at a steel plant in Buffalo to support the family. For a while, John was active in fraternal organizations. Hazel was a member of Hope Chapel Union Church. And there's a prize that was funded by in John Eskridge's name that was awarded to graduating students at Utica Free Academy. He was a longtime leader in the Boy Scouts. This is Jenny. She comes from the Baird family, and she married into the Frank family. Both of those families had members who were enslaved before abolition in New York. Jeannie's mother was Ellen, who was born in 1869, and Jeannie was married when she was just 16. Her father, Alan C. Baird, was a farmer in Marcy, and she appeared to have she appeared to have stopped living with her husband and was listed as a widow in 1950. Laura King was active socially and noticed in several articles. She was at a surprise birthday party for James E. L. Wormworth. She may have been a sister of Miss Maxine King, who was a member of Hope Chapel. She was part of the Lincoln Day program, where a number of descendants of the Civil War spoke. It sounds like it would be an interesting program. I'll try to find an article about it and see who actually spoke. Lillian Lewis, lovely. I could find nothing about her, no information anywhere. Flossie Moore is probably Hazel Eskridge's sister. They lived together, their husbands worked together. Flossie's husband was Cain Moore, and Cain and Flossie bought a house in Utica at 610 Utica Road. That house, they seem to have owned another house at 621 Utica Road, but it could be that the numbers were just changed or wrong or something. Flossie and Cain had a daughter named Mabel L. Moore. Edward Parker, I did not find anything in the records I consulted about him. Alberta, was born in Alabama. Her parents were also born there. Her husband, Charles E. Warfield, was a waiter at a hotel. They were married in 1918, and they lived at 17.5 Washington Street. He was a veteran of World War I. Charles was born around 1889 in Pennsylvania, and his mother was born there too. and his father was born in Maryland. Alice is just 16 in this photo. In 1930, she's already out of her family home and living in a house owned by Harry E. Burt and his wife. Burt is a lumber merchant owning H.E. Lumber Incorporated. She wasn't the only person serving living in the home. There was an African-American cook there too, Cleva Roberts, who was 40, and hopefully these two got along so that young Alice had a friend there. Alice was active at St. Paul Baptist Church and was a director of a concert given during the Thanksgiving service when she was about 26. She was also a member of Hope Chapel and with the Calendar Club, which was founded in 1950. Okay, so we've made it through all the people who are named on the back of the photo. There's only one person who I was able to identify based on her having the hand on Leroy Anderson's shoulder, the very first pair I showed you. I thought at first it might be that she was his wife, but then I looked them up and found their ages and realized that she was his mother. I've got 11 more people who are not named by this person who recognized so many people. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but in the handout that I gave you, there's, on the back page, there is a list of names that were contemporary with this photo that I just scraped out of newspapers. And so if anyone looks like anyone or anybody knows anything, let me know. So here's this lovely lady. Everybody, I feel like we should know their names. I'm incredibly frustrated. And this substantial gentleman, he looks like we should know what his name is. This lady is a little older. She's probably around Utica for many years, but I have no idea about her. And this guy looks so nice and friendly. Look at him. Wish I knew his name. Same true for her. She's got a nice dress on. She's got her pearls on. She's dressed up. I love this hat, and I love this dress. I wish we knew who she was. And look at this guy. I mean, he managed to get the best paper hat of everybody. He's got like a crown on, and he's looking off into the future. This guy, the guy who's standing behind him, which I think might be Ebo, has his hand on his shoulder. I look at this guy and I think, you know, I've seen those glasses walking around Manhattan like just last week. I mean, he looks like he could just pluck him out and put him right down. He'd be fine. Tall, handsome guy. No idea. Very intense-looking young man. Also unknown. And this fellow, and that's it. So what have I learned from all of these tidbits, these little pieces of information? Certainly a lot of people had come from the South, but not all. Some people had deep histories in Utica. Some had lived in New York State, or their parents had lived in New York State. It's clear that even though they organized themselves into a fraternal organization and were working hard to get ahead, that the millstone of racism still holds them down to jobs like porter, cleaner, driver, maid, domestic. There's a few professionals in the picture, but all these people had skills. They all had skills. The women were active fundraisers and organizers. They had produced all kinds of money for Hiram Lodge. If you were to name them now, you'd call them party planners or development directors, right? William Howard, who supervised the operation to rebuild Hiram Lodge after the fire, he had an extremely challenging task. He had to allocate money for materials. He had to organize work shifts. He had to keep the renovation moving. They did it in less than a year. I imagine him on the night of the fire. They'd just gone through building out the building, and then they're standing there and the thing is burning. He'd worked so hard to get the lodge together, and now he had to do it again. He worked on the building and then went to his paying job as a laborer at a sheet metal business. Perseverance, determination drove this group to raise money to build and rebuild. I'm so glad they had a photo taken of all of them so they could reach out to the future and say, I was here. After we're done with the questions, I want to present one of these photos to Hope Chapel for them to have, and another one for the History Center to have, so that we can show that we want to encourage everybody to get into looking up Black history and learning more about Oneida County's history. So thank you so much for coming.